Until now, we have only added transitions and animations to single elements, so now it's time to work with multiple elements. Before diving into the code, I want to mention a few things. While we have used the transition component until now, we need to use a component named transition-group when working with more than one element. With this component, it's important to know that each nested element is required to have a key attribute with a unique value. Otherwise, Vue will issue a warning and the code will not work. This is because Vue needs to be able to uniquely identify each individual item, but we will see that in a moment. Another thing to note is that unlike the transition component, the transition group component does in fact render an element to the DOM. This element wraps the nested elements and is a span element by default, although this can be changed by using the tag attribute. So in case something doesn't look quite as you expect or something like that, then be sure to keep this in mind. Lastly, I just want to mention that when using the transition group component, the JavaScript hooks and CSS classes are named the same as we saw before. With those things out of the way, let's dive into some code. So I have a project opened up, which outputs the numbers 1 to 10, each within a span element. The numbers are stored in a numbers data property. I have added a button for adding a new random number to the list and another to remove a random number. The JavaScript methods just implement this logic and are not really interesting in regards to transitions and animations. So let me just quickly show you what it looks like within the browser. So I can click this button to add a random number and click this one to remove a random number. Alright, so surely this application is nothing special, but let's make it slightly more appealing, at least however appealing a list of numbers can possibly be. You probably guessed what I want to do: add a transition for whenever a number is added or removed. Since we're now dealing with multiple elements, we'll need to use the transition group component as a wrapper for the elements. So let's wrap this span within a transition group tag, and notice that this span has a v4 directive on it, so that's why there will be multiple elements within this transition group tag. And as with the normal transition tag, I can specify a name for the transition, which I will name fade. Surely we're going to need some CSS styles as well. Since I have named the transition fade, this will be the prefix for the CSS classes. So let's go down to the style section and begin to type out some styles. So for the fade enter active class and the fade leave active class, I will add a transition CSS property, and I'll transition all properties for 1 second. You will see why in just a moment. And then for the fade enter and fade leave toe classes, I'll set the opacity to 0, and I want to apply a transformation where I want to rotate by 45 degrees and then translate y, so move on the y-axis by minus 30 pixels. And that's why I specified the all keyword within the transition property, because I'm transitioning more than one property here. With that, let's see it in action and hope that everything works. But if I refresh the page, you will see that the list is no longer displayed. Let's open up the browser's console for clues as to why. And sure enough, here we see a view warning stating that children to the transition group component must be keyed. This is what I mentioned earlier about having to add a key attribute, so let's go back to the code and fix that. So for the span element, I have to add a key attribute, and since I need to make this unique and thereby dynamic, I'll use the vbind directive, and the value is just going to be n, matching the alias within the v4 loop. And back to the browser, we should now see the transition when adding or removing numbers. But we can also see that the elements are jumping around a bit when adding a new number or when removing one. This is because the particular element is taking up space in the DOM immediately when adding it. And in the case of removing a number, the space is only cleared when the number is removed from the DOM. So how do we fix that? Let's take a look in the next lecture.